African history connects us to this present, right? So Melissa's discussion of Dred Scott and my kind of introduction of the ways in which we need to think about state violence isn't as if it occurred in 1995 or 98, as well as this kind of racial divide, right, between whites and blacks and their perception of state violence and the impact of state violence on communities. So my question are, what moments in American history connect us to this present moment post-Ferguson, and how should we think of this notion of an expendable black body as a way to ground our discussion on state violence with black communities?
I'm happy to address that question because I've written about it. It's interesting. You can go back even further than Dred Scott. You can go back to the first slave codes that were introduced when slavery was sort of developing and becoming cemented within American fabric, and look at the codes that are specific to Africans and to black bodies. The idea that you can't read, you can't bear arms, you can't gather in groups, you can't be away without a pass, even to some of the most popular events that we may be familiar with. I mentioned Crispus Attucks. Some people know him as sort of the first casualty of the American Revolutionary War. The Boston Massacre has sort of become infamous for this particular scene. But it's John Adams, President John Adams, who defends the British soldiers who wound up shooting and killing Crispus Attucks, who many know it was an African-American man, and uses within the court documents describing his description. He talks about him being tall, him being a mulatto, him being threatening, and he sort of says it's obvious, isn't it, that the British soldiers should have been afraid of him or should have felt threatened by him. So what we see in Ferguson is not new, unfortunately. What we've seen with Trayvon Martin is not new. You can go back almost every single decade into the founding of this country and find a Trayvon Martin and find a Mike Brown in very similar situations. And I think it's the way that we treat black men as fearful, as threatening, as intimidating, not just to white bodies, but to white supremacy, which I think is most important to sort of harp on. The idea that they are the threat to the white institutions. It's been something that's been repeated over and over and over again since the founding of this country.
To piggyback on that, this much earlier history, when we think practically how the law has operated against black bodies, and we can see clearly from the foundation of our Union, our United States, from the colonial movement to forming states, the state was predicated on maintaining slaves, maintaining black bodies, identifying blacks as non-citizens, not having all of the inalienable rights of the Constitution. But even before that, there were slave patrol laws. There was a law that was invented in 1704, which gave all white people the right and the duty to surveillance black bodies. And from this law, our criminal justice system develops, giving white bodies the right to be suspicious of another body, and that's a non-white body, the black body. So fast forwarding ahead, we have our criminal justice system structured on that sort of principle, and it's never been shattered. The idea that we can look at a person's behavior and look at a person's appearance and find them suspicious is not new. It's the single thread that goes throughout time. And it hasn't changed over time. So when we find what happened to Mike Brown on August 9th of this summer, it was something that was not an aberration. It wasn't something new. It wasn't something different. Mike Brown isn't a martyr. He isn't a single individual. He actually is a symbol of how the law treats black bodies. And that is, you see a black body, and it is in fact expendable. There are going to be no consequences if you kill that black body. And part of it is we have law enforcement that are protected. The officer in this case, his identity was protected for 6 days. Why, that is? we have no idea. But also, he, as a state officer, is also protected under municipality laws that allow an officer to do his duty without fearing being sued every time he makes a mistake. So he's shielded sometimes from civil lawsuits. We have a system that protects dominance over black bodies and non-white bodies.
To sort of echo the comments that have gone before me, Michael Brown, Oscar Grant, Renisha McBride, Trayvon Martin are all a part of, they tell two stories, I think. On the one hand, they kind of speak to a revival, or not a revival, a continuance of the lynching tradition in the United States, right? If we think about lynching as more than simply a reference to black bodies swinging from trees, but rather as a reference to a larger system of racialized terrorism, wherein white violence against black bodies goes unchecked by the law, then we see that the predicament of black people in 2014 is identical to what it was in 1955, the summer of Emmett Till's murder, right? So part of what we're dealing with is kind of making sense of the changing scene, that the places and the people and some of the bodies have changed, but the narrative has not. On the other hand, we need to be able to connect Ferguson and Michael Brown in these recent instances to a larger story of the disaster of race relations in the age of Barack Obama, right? That I think that when we look back at this moment, historians and cultural commentators will think about the Obama era as one of the most ironic periods in African American history, right? Where what does it mean to have one black man in the White House but 2 million in the jailhouse? Wrestling with that kind of fundamental inconsistency, or what the historian Jelani Cobb calls the paradox of progress, is part of what Ferguson is about and part of the kind of conversation about where do we go from here. Part of it also is about moving beyond what I would call the ruse of neoliberal multiculturalism. Fancy term for this idea that having black people in positions of power or having black people in high places will lead to structural transformation on the ground. We know the exact opposite is true. Under the Obama administration, black progress in every conceivable, black life in every conceivable area of, measurable area of social progress has actually declined under the Obama administration, right? So black poverty, black unemployment, black mass incarceration are all worse in 2014. Housing are all worse in 2014 than what they were in 2008, right? This is happening at precisely the same moment that we have a black man as the head of the American empire, and a black man as the director of the Department of Justice.
Yeah.
So what does that kind of say?
And hopefully
And
another
black
black
woman.
woman, right?
Yes.
Yeah.